What's going on, it's Suk and I'm back with a brand new video on SuperDuprTech, and in today's video I'll be showing you the results that I got when running a number of different benchmarking tests on the brand new 14-inch M3 Pro powered MacBook Pro. We are on the road to 5,000 subscribers, so if you are new around here then I must ask you to hit the subscribe button, clicking the bell to be notified of when a new video goes live. But without any further ado, let's hit the titles. Before I start, I do want to quickly mention that this is the entry model, which means it comes with an 11 core CPU, a 14 core GPU, 18 GB of unified memory, along with 512 GB of SSD based storage. And if you take a look towards the menu bar on this MacBook Pro, you'll notice a thermal readout which includes the status of the fan. And to the right of that, you'll see an approximation of the battery life. So the first benchmarking application which I ran on this MacBook Pro was from GeekBench 4, which was ran through Rosetta as it's no longer natively available through macOS. Now GeekBench is good as it runs a number of different tests and algorithms, and depending on how it's performed and how long it took to perform them, it will then give a score accordingly. So for this MacBook Pro, I got a single core score of 7,869 and a multi-core score of 38,617. I also performed GeekBench 4's graphics test, testing the 14 core GPU found in this M3 Pro. It's worth noting that this is a binned model, which means it doesn't have an 18 core GPU like we see with other models. As I mentioned, this is the entry model. So the first compute test which I ran through GeekBench 4 was their OpenCL test, and when running the OpenCL test I got a score of 174,925, and when running the Metal test I got a score of 137,070. The next testing application which I ran was once again from GeekBench, but this time from their newer version GeekBench 5, which has an increased amount of tests which are designed to further tax the machine. So when running the GeekBench 5 CPU test, I got a single core score of 1,737. I also got a multi-core score of 10,098. And when running the compute test through GeekBench 5, I got an OpenCL score of 42,395, whereas I got a Metal score of 43,477. I also ran GeekBench's latest set of tests in GeekBench 6. So when running the CPU test, I got a single core score of 3,127, and I also got a multi-core score of 14,311. On the OpenCL test, I got a score of 42,945, and when testing the Metal compute performance, I got a score of 68,683. So sticking to the trend of testing the CPU, I then ran CineBench R20. Now when running CineBench R20, I got a score of 3,610, and when running CineBench R23, I got a single core score of 1,944 with a multi-core score of 13,320, which gives us a ratio of 6.85. I also ran CineBench's latest set of tests found in CineBench 2024, and when running this, I got a single core score of 139, a multi-core score of 916, which gives us a ratio of 6.57. I also ran the GPU test through CineBench 2024 and got a score of 5,440. The next benchmarking application which I ran on this MacBook Pro was GFXBench Metal, which is designed to test the performance of the 14 core GPU found within the M3 Pro in this MacBook Pro. So GFXBench runs a number of different tests of both higher and lower levels of intensity, but in the interest of saving some time, I have calculated the average across each category. But as always, I'll show you each individual result. So the average I got for the higher intensive tasks was 342.51 frames per second, and for the lower I got a score of 334.17 frames per second. So sticking to the trend of testing the GPU portion of the M3 Pro, I ran several different tests from 3D Mark, and starting off with their wildlife test, which was useless as it maxed this test with it clocking 120 frames per second. And when running the wildlife stress test, I got a high score of 20,040 and a low score of 20,026. which goes to show that the 14-inch chassis of this MacBook Pro is doing a good enough job when it comes to cooling the processor. Therefore, I ran the Wildlife Extreme test. Now when running this test, I got a score of 11,960. You'll also find that this MacBook clocked in 71.6 frames per second on average. When running the Wildlife Extreme stress test, I got a high score of 11,988 with a low score of 11,941, which once again goes to show that this MacBook Pro is doing a good enough job at cooling the M3 Pro. I also wanted to test how good the M3 Pro found in this MacBook Pro would do when it comes to running a number of ray tracing tests. So I ran the Solar Bay test from 3D Mark. Now when running this test, I got a score of 19,157 with it clocking an average of 72.8 frames per second. When running the Solar Bay stress test, it got a high score of 19,122 and a low score of 19,086. Once again, quite good. I then rendered a number of different scenes using Blender. So when running the classroom scene using the CPU, it took 8 minutes and 12 seconds to complete, whereas it took 1 minute and 25 seconds to complete this render using the GPU. Now when using Blender 4.0, which is a slightly newer version of Blender, it took 6 minutes and 12 seconds to complete using the CPU, whereas it was a lot faster on the GPU side, coming in at 55 seconds. And when rendering the BMW scene using the CPU, it took 3 minutes and 32 seconds to complete, whereas it took 35 seconds using the GPU. And once again, using Blender 4.0 to render the BMW scene using the CPU, it took 2 minutes and 42 seconds to complete, and when using the GPU, it took 22 seconds to complete, which is really good. The next test I ran was NovaBench 2. Now NovaBench is a good general benchmark as it tests everything from the CPU, the GPU, the system storage along with the unified memory. So for this test I got a score of 2,795, and when running the VRAY test I got a score of 8,452. I then ran the Shadow of the Tomb Raider benchmark at both medium and high settings, and when running it at medium settings using this Mac's native resolution of 3024 by 1964, it managed to render 4,254 frames with it averaging 27 frames per second, and when running this test at native resolution with high settings, it rendered 4,255 frames averaging 27 frames per second. When running this test at 2560 by 1600 with medium settings, it managed to render 5,811 frames averaging 36 frames per second, and when running this benchmark with high settings, it rendered 5,608 frames averaging 35 frames per second. When dropping the resolution to 1920 by 1200 and running the benchmark with medium settings, it rendered 9,037 frames averaging 57 frames per second. When running with high settings, it this time managed to render 8,639 frames averaging 54 frames per second. And finally, lowering the resolution to 1200 by 854, it managed this time to render 14,408 frames averaging 92 frames per second at medium settings, and when increasing the graphics settings to high, it managed to render 13,672 frames averaging 82 frames per second. I then ran an SSD speed test using the Blackmagic disk speed test and got write speeds of 4,269 megabytes per second and read speeds of 5,099 megabytes per second, which is decently fast. I also ran the Aegis Systems disk speed test and got write speeds of 5,780 megabytes per second and read speeds of 5,252 megabytes per second. So it's safe to say that the SSDs on the M3 Pro models are much more capable than the M3 models. I then ran the AnTuTu HTML browser benchmark and got a score of 90,236. I then ran Speedometer 2.0 and got scores of 577.2. The next benchmark which I ran, it came from Unigine benchmarking tools, and the first test which I ran was their Valley test. So when running this test at 1512 by 982, I got a score of 5,020 with an average frame rate of 120 frames per second. And when I lowered the resolution to 1440 by 900, I got a score of 4,929 with an average frame rate of 117.8 frames per second. The next benchmarking test which I ran on this MacBook Pro was once again from Unigine benchmarking tools, but this time I ran their Heaven test. And when running this test at 1512 by 982, I got a score of 3554 with an average frame rate of 141.1 frames per second. And when I lowered the resolution to 1440 by 900, I got a score of 3722 with an average frame rate of 147.8 frames per second. The final test I ran on this MacBook Pro was a timed video export using Final Cut Pro with background rendering turned off. Now when exporting a 5-minute 24-second video file to H.264 and 1920 by 1080, it took 40 seconds to complete. And finally, when exporting this video project to 3840 by 2160 4K resolution, it took 2 minutes and 35 seconds to complete. So that'll be it for today's video. Of course, if you enjoyed the video, then be sure to smack the like button, and if you are new around here and want to be one of the first 5,000 people to do so, then be sure to subscribe clicking the bell icon to be notified of when a new video goes live. If you've got any questions with anything you've seen in today's video, then be sure to leave them down below in the comment section, or alternatively you can hit me up on my social media, links to which can be found down below in this video's description. Once again, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Take care and have a good one.